The call came on a Tuesday morning. I was standing in my kitchen in Chicago, still in my pajamas, holding a mug of coffee I hadn't touched yet, when my phone buzzed on the counter. I didn't recognize the number. Wisconsin area code. I almost let it go to voicemail. I almost didn't answer. I wish I could tell you I had some instinct, some gut feeling that this was the moment everything was about to change. I didn't. I just answered because I had nothing else going on at 8:43 in the morning. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, the kind of voice that belongs to someone who delivers difficult information for a living. Miss Wentworth, my name is Daniel Pruitt. I'm an estate attorney based in Green Bay. I have some matters relating to your biological family that require your immediate attention. I set the coffee mug down. I hadn't heard the words biological family spoken out loud in 11 years. The room didn't spin. The floor didn't drop. I just felt that old familiar coldness settle into my chest like it had never really left. Whatever you're about to tell me, I said, I need you to start from the beginning. He did. And by the time he finished, I was sitting on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet, knees pulled to my chest, 20 years of silence finally cracking open like a fault line running straight through my life. Before I go any further, if stories about truth, survival, and the kind of family loyalty that cuts both ways hit close to home for you, please take a moment to subscribe. I share stories like this every week and I would love for you to be part of this community. Now let me take you back all the way back to Green Bay, Wisconsin, and the year I stopped being someone's daughter. My name is Jasmine Wentworth. I am 34 years old. And this is the story of how my own mother gave me away at 14 years old, what she was hiding when she did it, and how the truth she buried for 2 decades came back and changed absolutely everything. Green Bay in February is the kind of cold that doesn't ask permission. It comes through the walls, through the windows, through the soles of your shoes if you stand outside for more than 30 seconds. I grew up on Libel Street in a narrow 2-story house with a furnace that rattled like it was arguing with itself and a front yard that flooded every spring. My mother, Carlotta Wentworth, was a woman who wore her bitterness the way other women wore perfume. Constantly and without apology. She worked the front desk at an insurance company downtown and came home every evening with the specific exhaustion of someone who blamed everyone around her for the life she hadn't managed to build. My father, Raymond, left when I was 6. Not dramatically, not with a fight or a scene. He just packed a single bag on a Sunday afternoon while I was watching cartoons and walked out the front door like he was heading to the grocery store and simply never came back. Carlotta never explained it. She just started referring to him in the past tense and eventually I learned to do the same. What she never told me, what I wouldn't find out until I was sitting on that kitchen floor in Chicago 20 years later, was that Raymond's departure had less to do with unhappiness and everything to do with something Carlotta had done. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I was the oldest of 2. My brother Marcus was 3 years younger, a quiet kid with big ears and a serious face who followed Carlotta around like a shadow, absorbing her moods, mirroring her silences. Marcus and I were never close, not the way siblings on television were close. We coexisted. We passed each other in hallways, ate dinner at the same table, watched the same programs on the same television set. But there was always something between us that I couldn't name when I was young. A distance that felt less like personality and more like instruction. Like someone had told him to keep his space from me and he had simply obeyed. Carlotta was not a violent woman. I want to be clear about that because what she did to me wasn't the kind of thing that leaves marks anyone can see. She was cold. Precise. She had a way of making you feel like an inconvenience without ever raising her voice. She forgot my birthdays not every year but enough years that I stopped expecting her to remember. She came to one parent conference in 4 years of middle school. She never asked about my friends or my grades or what I was thinking about at night when I couldn't sleep. She fed me, clothed me, kept the lights on. If you made a list of the minimum requirements for keeping a child alive, Carlotta hit every single one. But there is a difference between keeping someone alive and making them feel like their life matters. Carlotta never learned that difference, or maybe she just never cared to. There was one exception to all of this. My grandmother, Estelle Pruitt, my father's mother, who lived 20 minutes away on Elmore Street in a house that always smelled like cinnamon and old books. Grandma Estelle was a retired schoolteacher with silver hair she kept pinned up and reading glasses she was always losing and finding again in impossible places. She called me her little jazz note because I was, she said, unpredictable and necessary. She came to every school play, every science fair, every soccer game I ever played. She kept a drawer in her kitchen specifically stocked with the snacks I liked, and she never once made me feel like showing up at her door was an imposition. Grandma Estelle and Carlotta did not get along. I understood this the way children understand adult tensions, in fragments, in lowered voices, in the way a room changed when one of them entered it while the other was already there. Carlotta never stopped me from seeing Grandma Estelle, but she never encouraged it either. She would drop me off at the curb on Elmore Street without coming inside, and she would pick me up without getting out of the car. Whatever was between them, it ran deep and it ran old, and neither of them ever fully explained it to me. When I was 12, Grandma Estelle pressed a small key into my palm one afternoon while we were sitting on her back porch. She told me it opened the wooden chest under her bed. She told me not to open it yet. She told me I would know when the time was right. I asked her what was inside. She smiled the way she always smiled when she was keeping something good for later. She said, "Everything you'll need when you're ready for it." I put the key on a thin chain around my neck and wore it every day without telling anyone. 2 years later, everything I thought my life was built on simply fell away. I was 14 years old and it was late March, the tail end of winter, the kind of week where the snow turns gray and exhausted and everyone in Green Bay is done pretending they enjoy the cold. Carlotta called me into the kitchen on a Thursday evening. She was standing at the counter, not sitting, which I noticed because Carlotta always sat when she had something to say. She was standing with her arms crossed and her eyes fixed on a point slightly above my head, like she was addressing the wall behind me rather than me specifically. She told me that she had made arrangements. She said the word arrangements the way you'd say weather, neutral, factual, entirely disconnected from any emotional weight. She told me that I would be going to live with a family in Appleton. A couple named the Dailies. He said they were good people. He said this was the best decision for everyone. He did not ask what I thought. She did not explain why. She did not look me in the eye once during the entire conversation. I remember asking, "Am I being punished?" He said no. I asked if I had done something wrong. She said, "This has nothing to do with you." I remember thinking even then that those two answers could not both be true. Either it had nothing to do with me, in which case there was a reason she wasn't sharing, or it had everything to do with me and she just didn't want to say it out loud. I left on a Saturday morning. One suitcase, a backpack, and the key on the chain around my neck. Marcus stood at the top of the stairs and watched me drag the suitcase through the front door. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't move. He just watched with that same careful stillness he always had, and I remember thinking that he didn't look surprised. Not even slightly. I remember thinking that he already knew. The drive to Appleton took 40 minutes. Carlotta and I didn't speak once. She turned the radio to a talk station and kept her eyes on the road, and when she pulled up in front of the Daily house on Stratton Avenue she put the car in park and said, "Be good." That was it. Be good. 2 words for a child she was leaving on a stranger's doorstep. I got out. I got my suitcase from the trunk. I watched her pull away without looking back. And I stood there on that sidewalk in Appleton, Wisconsin, with everything I owned in one suitcase, wearing a key around my neck that opened a box I didn't understand yet, wondering what I had done to deserve being erased. I was 14 years old. And I had just been given away like something Carlotta no longer had any use for. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have possibly known standing on that sidewalk, was that my grandmother Estelle had seen this coming. That she had spent 2 years quietly preparing for it. And that the key around my neck was not just a key. It was the first piece of a plan that would take another 20 years to fully unfold. The Dailies were not bad people. I want to say that clearly because this story is not about them. Carol and Dennis Daly lived in a modest ranch house on Stratton Avenue in Appleton with 2 golden retrievers named Biscuit and Henry and a kitchen that always had something warm on the stove. Carol was a dental hygienist who hummed while she cooked. Dennis drove a delivery truck and coached youth baseball on weekends. They were decent, ordinary people who had opened their home through a private arrangement that I was too young and too stunned to fully understand at the time. They never adopted me legally. They never tried to. I was simply there, housed and fed and treated with a kind of careful politeness that people extend to someone else's child when they're trying their best but aren't quite sure what they're dealing with. I spent 4 years in that house. I finished high school there. I made one real friend, a girl named Portia who sat next to me in AP English junior year and laughed at all the wrong parts of every book we read, which made her the most interesting person in any room. Portia knew I wasn't the Daily's daughter, not really, and she never made it strange. She just showed up the way good people do, consistently and without a lot of fanfare. I still talk to her twice a month. But I need to tell you about the years between being dropped off on that sidewalk and the Tuesday morning phone call that broke everything open, because the distance between those two moments is not empty. It is full. It is the whole shape of who I became. I did not hear from Carlotta once during those 4 years in Appleton. Not a birthday card, not a phone call, not a single letter. Marcus sent me one text the Christmas I turned 16. Said, "Hope you're good." I stared at it for a long time trying to decide if it was an olive branch or an obligation. I replied with, "You too." That was the last contact I had with either of them for years. I told myself it didn't hurt. I got reasonably good at believing it. What I could not stop thinking about, what lived in the back of my mind like a low-frequency hum I could never quite tune out, was Grandma Estelle. When Carlotta drove me to Appleton, she had not stopped on Elmore Street. She had not given me a chance to say goodbye. I hadn't seen Grandma Estelle since 2 weeks before the kitchen conversation. A Sunday afternoon where we'd made her chicken soup from scratch and she'd let me pick the music and we'd danced badly in the kitchen to an old Motown record she kept on vinyl. I had no idea that afternoon was a goodbye. I don't think she did either, at least not entirely. But she had given me that key 3 months before. And now, sitting in a stranger's house in Appleton with a key around my neck and no way to get back to Elmore Street, I started to wonder if she had known more than she let on. I called her once from the Daily's landline, 2 weeks after I arrived. She answered on the second ring and the sound of her voice undid me completely. I cried for about 30 seconds before I could form words. She didn't rush me. She just said, "I'm here, Jasnote. I'm right here." She told me she had tried to stop what happened. She didn't explain what that meant. She just said, "I tried," and then she said, "Keep the key safe," and then Carol Daly knocked on the kitchen door to tell me dinner was ready and I had to go. I told Grandma Estelle I would call again soon. I called 3 more times over the next 6 months. The 4th time the number was disconnected. I found out through a neighbor on Elmore Street, a woman whose number I tracked down through the Appleton Public Library's computer after school one afternoon, that Grandma Estelle had moved. The neighbor didn't know where. She said a man in a dark sedan had helped her load boxes one Thursday morning and that was that. No forwarding address, no explanation to anyone on the block. Just gone. I was 15 years old and the last person in the world who had ever made me feel like I mattered had simply disappeared, and I had no way to find her. I graduated high school with a 3.8 GPA and a full academic scholarship to the University of Illinois at Chicago. I packed everything I owned into the same suitcase I had arrived with, plus one additional duffel bag, and I took a Greyhound bus to Chicago because the Dailies offered to drive me and I told them I was fine, which was not entirely true but was the kind of thing you say when you've spent 4 years being quietly grateful and are now desperate for the relief of no longer needing to be. Carol cried a little at the door. Dennis shook my hand and told me I had a good head on my shoulders. I believed him mostly because I needed to. Chicago opened up around me like a language I hadn't known I already spoke. I studied communications with a minor in nonprofit management. I worked 20 hours a week at a coffee shop on North Clark Street and spent my weekends at the Harold Washington Library because it was warm and enormous and nobody expected anything from you there except that you be quiet. I was exceptionally good at being quiet. I had been practicing my whole life. By 23 I had an entry-level position at a nonprofit called Second Threshold that provided transitional support for teens aging out of foster care. The parallel to my own life was not lost on me. I had not technically been in the foster system. The daily arrangement had been private, brokered through a family lawyer whose name I did not know and whose role I did not fully understand until much later. But I knew what it felt like to be handed off. I knew what it felt like to sit in a room full of someone else's furniture and try to figure out where your edges were. The kids at Second Threshold recognized something in me and I recognized something in them, and we got along on the basis of that unspoken understanding better than any team-building exercise could have manufactured. I was 26 when I was promoted to program director. I was 29 when the organization's founder retired and named me as her successor. By 32 I was running a staff of 18 people and a budget that would have seemed impossible to the girl on the Greyhound bus. I had an apartment in Wicker Park, a savings account that didn't embarrass me, and a therapist named Dr. Osei who helped me understand, slowly and with considerable resistance on my part, that doing well professionally was not the same thing as being okay. I still wore the key around my neck. Every single day without exception. I had never gone back to Green Bay. I had never tried to contact Carlotta or Marcus again after that one text exchange. I told myself I was over it. I told myself I had built something real out of nothing and that was enough. I told myself the past was finished and sealed and that the key was just a habit I hadn't broken yet, like biting my nails or sleeping with the closet light on. I was wrong about all of it. The call came as I told you on a Tuesday morning in October. I was 34 years old. Daniel Pruitt, estate attorney, Green Bay. He was professional and careful with his words, the way lawyers are when they know the information they're carrying has weight. He told me that a woman named Estelle Pruitt had passed away 6 weeks earlier at a care facility in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. He told me she had been his client for over 15 years. He told me she had left behind a will. He paused in the way people pause when they are about to say something that will require you to sit down. Miss Wentworth, he said, you are the sole beneficiary of your grandmother's estate. I didn't speak. He continued. There are also documents she asked me to hold and deliver to you upon her passing. Some of them are going to be difficult to read. He paused again. And some of them will answer questions you may have stopped asking a long time ago. I asked him how much time I had before I needed to come to Green Bay. He said, take whatever time you need, but I would not wait too long. There are parties who are already aware of the estate and who may attempt to complicate the process. I asked him who those parties were. He said, your mother and your brother. I set the phone on the counter face down. I stood in my kitchen for a long time without moving. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago does in October: gray sky, wind off the lake, the particular cold that makes the city feel like it's trying to shake you loose. I thought about a key on a chain around a 15-year-old girl's neck. I thought about a disconnected phone number and a woman who had vanished quietly on a Thursday morning with her boxes and her vinyl records and her reading glasses she was always losing. I thought about a chest under a bed on Elmore Street that I had never opened. I went to my bedroom. I opened the drawer of my nightstand. I took out the key. I held it in my palm and I looked at it for a long time. Then I booked a flight to Green Bay for the following morning, called my assistant to clear my week, and texted my closest friend Portia 2 words. It's time. She replied in under a minute. I'm coming with you. I don't know what I expected to find when I got there. I don't think I let myself expect anything specific, because hoping for a particular outcome when your entire history with a place has been about loss is the kind of thing that breaks you before you even arrive. What I found in Green Bay was bigger than anything I had imagined. And what I found in those documents was not just the truth about why Carlotta gave me away. It was proof that the woman who loved me most had never, not for a single day, stopped fighting for me. Daniel Pruitt's office was on the second floor of a brick building on South Washington Street, 2 blocks from the Fox River. It was the kind of office that felt like it had been arranged specifically to make people feel that whatever happened inside it was serious and permanent. Dark wood paneling, bookshelves lined with identical legal volumes, a desk that looked like it weighed as much as a car. Daniel himself was in his late 50s, compact and precise, with the kind of stillness that comes from spending decades in rooms where people fall apart and need someone to stay steady. He stood when Portia and I walked in, shook both our hands, and gestured to the 2 chairs across from his desk without any unnecessary small talk, which I appreciated more than I could say. On the desk between us sat a wooden chest. Small, dark-stained oak brass latch. The kind of thing you'd find at an antique market and think was decorative. I recognized it immediately. I had never seen it in person, only heard about it. But I knew exactly what it was. It was the chest from under Grandma Estelle's bed on Elmore Street. The one the key around my neck had been waiting 20 years to open. Daniel placed a single sheet of paper in front of me first. He said, before we open anything, your grandmother left specific instructions about the order in which you receive this information. She was very deliberate about that. I told him I understood. He nodded, slid the paper closer and said, this is her letter to you. She wrote it 4 years ago when her health first started declining. She updated it twice. The version in front of you is the final one, dated 8 months ago. I picked it up. Portia put her hand on my arm and left it there. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten in the careful, slightly slanted script I remembered from birthday cards that had stopped arriving when I was 15. Grandma Estelle wrote the way she spoke, directly and without wasted words, but with a warmth underneath everything that made even the hard sentences feel like they came from a place of love rather than obligation. She started by telling me she was sorry. Not in a vague general way, but specifically. She was sorry she had not fought harder when Carlotta made her decision. She was sorry she had moved without finding a way to tell me where she was going. She explained that Carlotta had threatened her, that when Estelle had pushed back against the plan to send me to Appleton, Carlotta had told her that if she interfered she would ensure Estelle never had contact with me at all, and that she would tell anyone who asked that Estelle had been making inappropriate requests regarding my custody. It was a lie constructed to sound plausible, The kind of threat that works specifically because fighting it out loud makes you look guilty. Estelle had a teaching pension and a reputation in her community she had spent 40 years building. Carlotta knew exactly where to apply pressure and she applied it without hesitation. So Estelle had stepped back. Not because she stopped caring, she wrote, but because she made a calculation that staying close would cost me more than it protected me. She moved to Sheboygan to live near a former colleague. She hired Daniel Pruitt. And she spent the next 19 years doing quietly and from a distance what she had not been permitted to do openly. I put the letter down after the second page and sat with it for a moment. Portia didn't say anything. Daniel didn't either. Outside the window, Green Bay was doing ordinary things. A truck rolled past. Someone walked a dog on the sidewalk below. The world was completely indifferent to the fact that I was sitting in a lawyer's office reading a letter from a dead woman who had loved me enough to play a 20-year-long game to make sure I was protected. Daniel then opened the chest. Inside, organized in labeled folders with the same precision I imagined Estelle had applied to everything in her life, were 4 categories of documents. The first folder contained financial records. Estelle had established a trust in my name when I was 15 years old, the year she moved to Sheboygan. She had contributed to it consistently for 19 years from her teaching pension and the proceeds of selling the Elmore Street house. The current value of the trust, Daniel said, placing a single typed page in front of me, was just under $1.4 million. I heard Portia inhale sharply beside me. I didn't move. The second folder contained something I was not prepared for. Property records. The house on Elmore Street had not, as I had assumed, been sold outright. Estelle had sold it to a holding company that Daniel managed on her behalf. The arrangement meant the house had been generating rental income for nearly 2 decades, all of which had been added to the trust. The house itself, Daniel explained, was still technically an asset of the estate, which meant it was now mine. The third folder was the one Daniel had warned me about on the phone. He set it in front of me and left his hand on top of it for just a moment before he slid it over, a small gesture that I understood to mean brace yourself. Inside were documents relating to why Carlotta had given me away in the first place. Not speculation. Not inference. Actual documents, letters, legal filings, a notarized statement from my father Raymond Wentworth, signed 6 years ago, that laid out the full history in plain language. Raymond had not left when I was 6 because he was unhappy. He had left because Carlotta had given him a choice. She had discovered, through a private investigator she hired without his knowledge, that Raymond had a second family. A woman in Milwaukee named Diane and a daughter, 3 years older than me, named Celeste. The relationship had ended before I was born, but the daughter existed, and Raymond had been sending money to Diane quietly for years. Carlotta had confronted him privately and given him 2 options. Walk away completely, no contact with me, no custody arrangement, no presence in my life whatsoever, or she would expose the situation publicly in a way that would cost him his job and his reputation. Raymond had chosen to leave. He had signed whatever she put in front of him and disappeared, and Carlotta had told everyone, including me, that he simply hadn't wanted to stay. That was the first thing she had been hiding. The second was worse. When I was 12, 2 years before Carlotta sent me to Appleton, Raymond had reappeared. He had contacted Estelle, not Carlotta, because he understood by then that going through Carlotta was not a viable path. He had spoken to a family attorney. He wanted to establish contact with me, not full custody, not a disruption of my living situation, just the ability to be present in some form. He and Estelle had been quietly coordinating. He had filed a petition with the court to modify the original arrangement, to allow for supervised visitation. The petition had been granted conditionally, pending a home review. Carlotta had found out. And rather than allow Raymond any foothold whatsoever, she had made the decision to remove me from the equation entirely. If I was no longer in her home, Raymond had no legal basis to petition for access. The private arrangement with the Dailies had been structured specifically so that no court needed to be involved. No court involvement meant no record. No record meant no leverage for Raymond. She had given me away not because she didn't want me, though I believe she had stopped wanting me long before that, but because keeping me had become inconvenient to her control over the situation. I read Raymond's notarized statement twice. His handwriting was nothing like I had imagined. Neat, almost architectural. He described the sequence of events with the specific guilt of a man who had made a cowardly decision and spent years figuring out how to live with it. He did not make excuses. He said, "I failed my daughter and I am documenting this truth because she deserves to know it regardless of what it costs me." I set the statement down on Daniel's desk. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I had expected to cry. I didn't. I felt instead a profound and clarifying anger, the kind that doesn't make you loud but makes you very, very still. Daniel gave me 10 minutes. He and Portia stepped out into the hallway and I sat alone in that office with the open chest and the 4 folders and the letter from my grandmother, and I let the full architecture of what Carlotta had built come into focus. The coldness. The erasure. The careful management of every relationship I might have had that could have given me a foothold in the world. She had not simply given me away. She had engineered my isolation with the precision of someone who understood exactly how much damage she was doing and had decided the cost was acceptable. When Daniel came back and he sat down, folded his hands and told me about the 4th folder. "This one," he said, "contains communications from your mother and your brother over the past 3 months." He did not editorialize. He just opened it and placed the first printed email in front of me. It was from Marcus to Daniel, sent 11 weeks ago, 2 weeks after Estelle passed. The subject line read, "Regarding the Pruitt estate." Marcus wrote that as a blood relative and the only family member who had maintained a relationship with Estelle in her final years, he believed he had a legitimate claim to a portion of the estate and would be pursuing that claim through his own attorney if necessary. I looked up at Daniel. He met my eyes. "There is no legal basis for his claim," he said. "Your grandmother's will is unambiguous. But that has not stopped them from trying." The second document was an email from Carlotta to Daniel, sent 3 days after Marcus's. It was 3 paragraphs long. In the first paragraph she described herself as a devoted mother who had made difficult decisions under impossible circumstances. In the second she suggested that Estelle had been mentally compromised in her final years and that the will may not reflect her true intentions. In the third she said she hoped this could be resolved without involving the courts, but that she was prepared to do whatever was necessary to ensure her family was treated fairly. I read that word. Family. I read it twice. Then I picked up my phone and called my attorney in Chicago. My attorney in Chicago was a woman named Sandra Okafor. I had hired her 3 years earlier to handle contracts for Second Threshold, and she had impressed me enough that I kept her on retainer for personal matters as well. Sandra was 47, originally from Houston, and she had the rare quality of being simultaneously warm and absolutely terrifying in a legal context. When I called her from Daniel's office hallway and walked her through everything in about 8 minutes flat, she was quiet for exactly 4 seconds before she said, "Send me everything tonight. Every document, every email, every letter. I want it all in my inbox before you go to sleep." Then she said, "Do not contact your mother or your brother directly. Not a text, not an email, not a voicemail. Nothing." I said I understood. She said, "I mean it, Jasmine." I said I understood again, and I did. Portia drove us to the hotel while I sat in the passenger seat with the chest on my lap and said almost nothing for 30 minutes. She did not push. Portia had known me for nearly 20 years and she understood that I process things in layers, that the first layer is always silence and the second is always questions, and by the third I would be ready to talk. She turned on the radio low and drove and let me exist in the quiet of someone who has just had the architecture of their entire childhood rearranged. We were staying at a hotel on Lombardy Avenue, clean and unremarkable. I sat on the edge of the bed and photographed every document in the chest and emailed the full set to Sandra. Then I opened the chest one more time and looked at what was left after all the folders had been removed. At the very bottom, beneath a thin layer of dark velvet lining I had not noticed earlier, was a small envelope. Not sealed. Just tucked flat against the wood. My name on the front in Grandma Estelle's handwriting. Not Jazz note this time. Just Jasmine. Like she had known this part needed to be serious. Inside was a single index card. On it, in her careful script, was a name and a phone number. Celeste Wentworth. And below the name 4 words. She has been waiting. I stared at that index card for a long time. Celeste Wentworth. My father's other daughter. My half-sister technically, though that word felt both accurate and completely inadequate at the same time. Estelle had known about her. Of course she had. Estelle had apparently known everything. The question was how long Celeste had known about me and what exactly she had been waiting for. I did not call that night. I put the card in my wallet, ordered room service I barely touched, and lay on top of the hotel bed covers fully dressed staring at the ceiling while Portia slept with the steady breathing of someone who does not have a 20-year secret detonating in her chest. What kept circling back was Marcus. I had spent 20 years constructing a version of my brother I could live with. Not a villain, not someone I hated, just a person I did not know and had accepted I never would. A stranger who shared my last name and my mother's kitchen table and nothing else. But the email to Daniel, the one claiming he had maintained a relationship with Estelle in her final years, that was a specific lie. A targeted one. He had not visited Estelle in Sheboygan. Daniel had told me she had no family contact in her final 3 years, that she had specifically noted in her records that she did not want Carlotta or Marcus informed of her location. Marcus had constructed a false intimacy with a dying woman to manufacture a legal claim against her estate. That was not a stranger who shared my last name. That was something else entirely. Sandra called at 7 the next morning. She had read everything overnight. Her voice had that quality it gets when she is focused, lower than usual, all precision. The diminished capacity argument Carlotta's email hinted at was going nowhere. Estelle's medical records from the Sheboygan facility showed full cognitive clarity until 8 months before her death, and Daniel had 2 signed witness affidavits from the will signing dated 14 months ago. The will, Sandra said, is airtight. Your grandmother was thorough. Marcus's claim was equally without merit. As a biological grandchild, he had no standing to contest a will that explicitly named another beneficiary without evidence of undue influence or incapacity, neither of which he could establish. Then Sandra told me the part that changed the temperature of the conversation entirely. She had run a background check on Marcus overnight. He had 2 civil judgments against him from the previous 4 years. Unpaid debts totaling just over $60,000, both active, both in collections. Sandra paused. Then she said, your brother needs money. This is not a sentimental claim. He and your mother are not fighting for their piece of a family legacy. They have calculated that your grandmother's estate is their solution. I thought about Carlotta at that kitchen counter 20 years ago saying this had nothing to do with me. It was the same logic now. Everything had always had everything to do with me. I was just the variable they kept trying to remove from the equation. That afternoon Daniel arranged for us to visit the house on Elmore Street. The current tenants had recently vacated, their lease ending the same month Estelle passed, a detail Daniel said was not a coincidence. Estelle had structured the lease so the house would be available when it transferred. She had thought of everything. The house was smaller than I remembered, the way places always are when you carry them in memory from childhood. The front porch had the same white railing, paint peeling at the corners. The maple tree in the front yard was enormous now, double the size from summer afternoons eating apple slices beneath it. I walked up the porch steps alone and put my hand flat against the front door before Daniel unlocked it. Inside, the house smelled like dust and old wood and something underneath that my body recognized before my brain did. Something in my chest unlocked quietly, the way a door opens when the right key is finally used after years sitting in a lock. The kitchen still had the same window over the sink. The hardwood floors were the same. Someone had painted the living room a pale green Estelle would have hated. She was a cream and white person, but the bones of the room were exactly as I remembered. Portia came in after a few minutes and stood in the kitchen doorway and said quietly, you could do something with this. I knew what she meant. I had been thinking it since Daniel first mentioned the property. I had spent 11 years running an organization for displaced young people. I was standing in the exact house where the only person who had ever fought for me had lived her whole life. The parallel was not subtle. It was something I had already decided before I walked through the door. That evening Marcus called my cell phone. I stared at the screen for 4 rings and answered because Sandra had told me not to contact him first but had not told me what to do if he called, and because I had spent 20 years imagining what I would say if I ever got the chance. There was a pause when I answered, like he had not fully expected me to pick up. Then he said, Jasmine. His voice was older than I expected, lower. Hey. Like we had spoken last week. Like 20 years was nothing. I said, I know about the emails to Daniel. I know about the judgments. I know about all of it. He was quiet. Then he said, Mom just wants what's fair. I said, Carlotta gave me away at 14 to stop Dad from being able to see me. That is not a woman who is owed fairness from Grandma Estelle's estate. A longer silence. Then Marcus said something I had not expected at all. He said, I know what she did. I've always known. I just didn't think it was my place to say anything. I let that sit between us for a moment. Then I said, it was absolutely your place. It was your responsibility. You were my brother. He did not answer. I said, I have an attorney. Do not contact Daniel Pruitt again. I hung up and sat on the hotel bed feeling the hollow exhaustion of a conversation 20 years in the making that had lasted less than 3 minutes. Portia looked at me from across the room. I said he knew. The whole time he knew. She did not say anything. She just came and sat beside me and stayed there quietly and without being asked, which is the only kind of presence that actually helps when the ground is still settling beneath you. The next morning I called Celeste Wentworth. I had rehearsed nothing. I just dialed the number on the index card and stood at the hotel window and waited. She picked up on the third ring. Her voice was cautious the way a person's voice gets when an unknown number turns out to be something real. Oh. I said, my name is Jasmine Wentworth. I think you might know who I am. A silence, brief and sharp. Then she said, I have been waiting for this call for 6 years. Celeste was 37, lived in Milwaukee, and had found out about me through our father Raymond when she turned 30. She had tried once to find me, but my professional profile kept my personal history private. Estelle had contacted her 4 years ago, given her my name and told her to wait until after the estate was settled and I had time to understand the full picture. Estelle had been managing the timing of every revelation with the precision of someone who understood that too much truth delivered too fast is just another form of damage. I asked Celeste if she wanted to meet. She said yes before I finished the question. We agreed on the following afternoon, a coffee shop in Milwaukee, neutral ground, no agenda beyond 2 women who shared a father and had been kept from each other by choices neither of them made. I told Portia after I hung up. She was quiet for a moment and then said, your grandmother thought of everything. I said she really did. Then Portia picked up her keys and said I'll drive. The coffee shop in Milwaukee was called Ledger and Grounds, a narrow place on East Brady Street with exposed brick walls and mismatched wooden chairs and the kind of lighting that made everyone look like they were in the middle of a serious conversation even when they were just checking their phone. Portia and I arrived 12 minutes early. I ordered a black coffee I did not drink and sat facing the door because I needed to see Celeste before she saw me, not for any strategic reason, just because I had spent the entire drive down from Green Bay trying to prepare myself for what it would feel like to look at someone who carried half the same history I did and had been kept out of my life by a woman who confused control with motherhood. Celeste walked in at exactly the agreed time. She was tall with Raymond's coloring. That much was immediately apparent even though I had no recent frame of reference for what Raymond looked like. Dark eyes, strong jaw, the kind of face that is composed rather than guarded. A person who has learned to be careful with their expressions without losing warmth in them. She spotted me before I raised my hand. She stood in the doorway for just a moment, and then she crossed the room and sat down across from me and said, "You look like your grandmother." Her voice was steady but her eyes were not entirely. I said, "I've been told that." Then neither of us said anything for about 10 seconds, which sounds brief but was long enough to contain about 30 years of accumulated absence. We talked for 4 hours. Portia, bless her, ordered a sandwich and a second coffee and occupied herself with her phone and a book she had brought specifically so she could give us space without leaving the room entirely. Celeste told me about Raymond, who was 61 now and lived in Racine, who had retired from an accounting firm the previous year and who had, according to Celeste, spent the better part of the last decade in a state of low-grade regret that he had never fully known how to convert into action. He had told Celeste about me when she turned 30. He had given her my name and then, characteristically, had not taken any further steps himself, leaving the ball in her court and stepping back, which Celeste described with the specific weary affection of someone who had long ago made peace with her father's particular brand of passivity. She said, "He's not a bad person. He's just a person who has spent his whole life choosing the path that required the least confrontation, and eventually those choices compound into something that looks a lot like damage even if none of the individual choices felt catastrophic at the time." I thought about Raymond's notarized statement in Daniel's folder. The neat, architectural handwriting. I failed my daughter. I thought about how it was easier to write that sentence in a legal document than to pick up a phone. I did not say any of this to Celeste because she already knew it and had already done her own work to arrive at the place she was sitting, which was clearly somewhere past bitterness and into the more manageable territory of clear-eyed acceptance. I respected that. I was not entirely there myself, but I could see the path from where I was standing. Celeste asked me about the estate. I gave her the broad outline, not the financial specifics, just the structure. She listened without interrupting. When I finished she said, "Estelle called me once about 8 months before she passed. She was very direct. She told me that what had been taken from you was being prepared to be returned, and that the only thing she needed from me was patience and the willingness to show up when the time came. She paused. She said you were worth showing up for. I did not look away. I just nodded. Because I had spent most of my life operating on the assumption that I was not, and hearing it stated plainly by someone who had only ever known me at a distance was not a small thing. We exchanged numbers before we left. Not with the performative enthusiasm of people who intend to let the contact sit unused, but with the quiet intention of two people who understand that what they are beginning will take time and care and cannot be rushed into shape. Celeste hugged me at the door of the coffee shop. It was brief and genuine, the kind of hug that does not try to compensate for everything it cannot fix. I drove back to Green Bay feeling something I did not have an immediate word for, something adjacent to relief but more complicated, like a window being opened in a room that has been sealed for a very long time. The air coming in is good, but it takes a moment to adjust to the change in pressure. The probate hearing was scheduled for 11 days after my arrival in Green Bay. In the time between the coffee shop and the courtroom, Daniel and Sandra worked in close coordination across the 250 miles between them, filing responses to Marcus's claim, submitting Estelle's medical records and the witness affidavits, and preparing the full documentation of the trust's unbroken chain of custody. Sandra flew in from Chicago 2 days before the hearing. She met Daniel at his office on South Washington Street, and I sat in on that meeting and watched two attorneys who had never worked together before fall into an efficient professional rhythm within about 20 minutes, which was reassuring in the specific way that watching competent people do their jobs well is always reassuring when the stakes are personal. Carlotta did not attend the hearing. Her attorney appeared on her behalf, a man named Philip Greer who had the practiced composure of someone accustomed to arguing weak cases with confidence. Marcus was there, sitting at the respondent's table in a gray jacket that looked like it had been purchased recently for exactly this occasion. He did not look at me when I walked in. He looked at the table and kept his eyes there with the studied focus of a person pretending the room contains fewer people than it does. The hearing itself took less than 2 hours. Judge Annette Sorensen, 62, silver-haired, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and the expression of someone who had presided over enough contested estates to recognize the difference between a genuine dispute and a speculative one, moved through the documentation efficiently and without theater. Greer presented the diminished capacity argument. Sandra responded with Estelle's medical records and the psychiatrist's note confirming full cognitive clarity at the time of signing. Greer suggested the trust had been established under undue influence. Daniel produced 19 years of consistent contributions from Estelle's own accounts, a pattern so steady and long-standing that the suggestion of outside manipulation was, as Sandra put it in her response, not supported by a single piece of evidence in the record. Marcus's attorney presented the claim of maintained relationship. Daniel submitted Estelle's written instruction to the Sheboygan facility explicitly naming Carlotta and Marcus as individuals she did not wish to be contacted, dated 2 years before her death. Judge Sorensen reviewed the full file for 14 minutes. I counted. Then she looked up and delivered her ruling in the measured, unhurried tone of someone stating a fact rather than making a decision, because by that point it genuinely was more fact than decision. The will of Estelle Pruitt is valid and properly executed. The estate in its entirety transfers to the named beneficiary, Jasmine Wentworth, effective immediately. She looked briefly at Marcus's attorney. The respondent's claim is dismissed. There is no evidentiary basis to support it. She removed her reading glasses and set them on the bench. We're adjourned. Marcus stood up before the bailiff had finished speaking. He was halfway to the door before I could have said anything to him even if I had wanted to, which I did not. I watched him push through the courtroom door and disappear into the hallway without looking back, without a word to his attorney, without a single acknowledgement of the 20 years of silence that sat between us like furniture neither of us had chosen and neither of us had moved. I did not follow him. I sat in that courtroom for another full minute after everyone else had begun gathering their things, just sitting in the particular quiet of a room where something that needed to be decided has finally been decided. Sandra sat down next to me. She did not say congratulations, which I appreciated because it was not that kind of moment. He just said it's done. Then she put a hand briefly on my shoulder and stood up and went to speak with Daniel. I took out my phone and looked at the index card photo I had taken of Estelle's note. She has been waiting. I thought about Estelle in Sheboygan, 19 years of pension contributions and rental income and carefully maintained legal documents, 19 years of building something solid in the quiet, patient way of someone who has accepted that the right moment is not now but is coming and who intends to be ready when it does. Outside the courthouse the November air was sharp and the sky was the pale gray of old pewter and Green Bay smelled like it always had, cold water and industry and the specific clean emptiness of a city built for weather. Portia was waiting on the courthouse steps. She looked at my face when I came through the door and said, "It's over?" I said yes. She exhaled. Then she said, "Where do you want to eat?" I laughed, which surprised me, a real laugh, sudden and involuntary and exactly what I needed. I said, "Somewhere with good soup." Portia said, "This is Wisconsin. Every place has good soup." He was right. We walked down the block together in the cold and I thought about a 14-year-old girl in a car on the way to Appleton with one suitcase and a key on a chain around her neck and a grandmother who was already, quietly and without announcement, beginning to build the floor that would eventually catch her. I reached up and touched the key where it hung against my collarbone. Then I put my hands in my pockets and kept walking. 3 weeks after the hearing I was back in Chicago, sitting at my desk at Second Threshold on a Wednesday afternoon when my assistant knocked and told me there was a man in the lobby who did not have an appointment but had given his name and asked if I would see him. He slid a notepad across my desk. On it, in her handwriting, was a name I had not heard spoken aloud in nearly 30 years. Raymond Wentworth. I sat with that for a moment. Then I told her to send him in. He was older than I had constructed him in my imagination, which I suppose is always the way with people you have only ever known as an absence. 61, medium height, the same dark eyes Celeste had, gray spread through most of his hair. He wore a plain blue jacket and carried his hands in front of him in the careful way of someone trying to take up as little space as possible. He stood just inside my office door and did not move further until I gestured to the chair across from my desk. He sat down. He looked at me directly, which I had not expected, and said, "I should have come a long time ago." I said yes. He nodded like that was fair. Raymond did not make excuses. That was the thing I had braced for and it did not come. He said I was a coward. He said it plainly, the way you state a fact you have had a long time to verify. He said Carlotta's threat had worked because he had let it work. Because the path of least resistance had always been his path, and by the time he understood the cost he had already paid it in ways that could not be recovered. He said Estelle had written to him 4 years ago, and that her letter had said what he had been circling for decades without landing on. He said she had written, "Your daughter built herself a life in spite of you, not because of you. I want you to understand the difference before it is too late to matter." I asked what he wanted from this visit. He said nothing. "I just needed you to know that I know what I did. And I needed to say it to your face instead of in a notarized document." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about all the versions of this conversation I had rehearsed, the angry version, the cold version, the version where I said everything I had saved up. None of those versions fit the man across from me, who was not a monster but simply a person whose small cowardly choices had accumulated into something that cost his daughter her entire childhood. There is a particular anger reserved for that. Quieter than rage but longer lasting. I felt it. I let it be there. Then I said, "I appreciate you coming. That is all I have for you right now." He stood, nodded once and left. I watched the door close and sat with the unresolved feeling of a chapter that has been given an ending but not yet a meaning. Carlotta called 2 days later, directly from a number I did not recognize until she spoke. She opened with, "I want you to know I did what I thought was best." I said, "I know you believe that." She said, "I had reasons." I said, "I am not interested in your reasons, Carlotta." She asked if I was going to keep punishing her for the rest of her life. I said, "I'm not punishing you. I'm living my life in a direction that doesn't include you, and I think we both know that is the most honest outcome available." She started to say something else and I said, "I wish you well. I mean that." Then I ended the call, blocked the number and went back to the grant proposal on my desk because the work did not stop for any of this and I was glad it didn't. Marcus I did not hear from again. Sandra told me 3 months later he had settled his civil judgments and moved to Minneapolis. Whether he and Carlotta remained in contact I neither knew nor needed to know. The story of what Marcus chose and what it cost him was his to carry. I had put it down and I did not pick it back up. The house on Elmore Street took 5 months to renovate. I hired a contractor from Green Bay named Otto Brish who had done transitional housing work before and understood what the space needed to be: functional and warm and durable, The kind of place that could absorb the energy of young people who had not yet learned to be careful with things because nobody had ever taught them that the things in their life would stay. We kept Estelle's kitchen layout exactly as it was. We kept the maple tree and built a small bench around its base in the front yard. We painted the living room cream, which is what it should have been all along. Second Threshold on Elmore Street opened on a Friday in April. No press, no ribbon, no speeches. Just Daniel, who came because he had earned the right to see what the thing he had protected for 19 years had become. Portia, who drove up from Chicago and reorganized the supply closet on principle the moment she arrived. Celeste, who brought her son, a serious 7-year-old named Theo, who inspected every room with the thoroughness of a building inspector and declared the backyard acceptable. And 4 teenagers, 3 girls and 1 boy, all between 15 and 17, all from the Green Bay area, all carrying the specific careful stillness of young people who have learned not to assume that a good thing will last. I stood in Estelle's living room and told them the same thing I told every resident at every Second Threshold location. This house belongs to someone who believed that the right person in the right place at the right time can change the entire direction of a life. He gave it to me. Now I'm giving it to you. Use it like it matters because it does, and so do you. The boy, whose name was Darius, raised his hand. He asked, "Did someone give it to you because you needed it once?" I said yes. He nodded like that was the only answer that would have satisfied him and looked back at the room with an expression that was not quite trust but was the thing that comes just before trust, which is the most honest place to start. I still wear the key around my neck. I have no practical reason to keep it anymore. The chest has been opened, the documents filed, the house full of living. But some habits are not really habits. Some things you carry because they are the physical record of a person who loved you and trusted you would find your way to what they left. I'm not ready to put it down. I may never be. And I think Estelle would understand that. I started therapy again in January. A woman in Lincoln Park named Dr. Vasquez who drinks peppermint tea and does not let me use productivity as a deflection, which means our sessions are uncomfortable in the precise way that useful things often are. She asked me once what I would say to the 14-year-old version of myself if I could go back. I thought about it longer than I expected to. Then I said, "You are not the reason this is happening. And the people who are supposed to stay will stay. You just have not met them yet." Dr. Vasquez wrote something in her notebook. He asked, "Do you believe that now?" I said yes. He asked, "Did you believe it then?" I said no. She said, "That is the whole story right there, isn't it?" I said, "Yes, I suppose it really is. That is my story. Not pretty, not clean, not wrapped in anything that makes the hard parts easier to look at. My mother gave me away at 14 to protect a secret. My brother knew and said nothing for 20 years. My father wrote his guilt in a notarized document instead of a phone call. And my grandmother spent 19 years building a plan in complete silence to make sure that none of it would be the end of me. I'm not angry anymore. Not because the anger was wrong, it was entirely justified and I gave it its due time, but because I have found that building requires both hands and you cannot build with your fists clenched. So I opened them. I built. And the floor that Estelle started laying the year I left Green Bay on a Greyhound bus with 1 suitcase and a key I did not yet understand turned out to be exactly strong enough to hold everything I have become. That is what it looks like when someone loves you right. Not loudly. Not perfectly. But with enough patience and enough precision to still be standing when you finally arrive. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told. And here on Confira Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.